that brings me to the next question, which is, like listening to all of these, it seems to, and actually, Hermes has been running on Android for quite some time already. And so one would assume that, it's pretty much complete, I guess. But, like, I'm just curious, like, what's the roadmap here?
Yeah, I think we can start from the roadmap. Um,
Hmm.
I guess we are far from being completed. I think one thing that people notice is that, admittedly, Herm is a little behind of the JavaScript standard. And also, TC39 release features every year, so like completing all JavaScript feature would be always a moving target. Um, so it's definitely on our plan to support more and modern JavaScript features, but also we want to implement those features in a way that won't regress. There was a recent hacker news about using let cons in JSC was 3 times slower than using var. So we don't want a let cons like that. So we also only um, so we usually only launch a feature when it's proved to be not regress anything or have some improvement. There are also features in JavaScript that are more important to React Native than else. The current promise in React Native is polyfield with set immediate. So promise is scheduled as a priority of timer, but not micro tasks. This is true regardless what JavaScript engine you're using. We're working on improving this since it's required to enable React concurrent mode for React Native. So that's JavaScript feature coverage. The second major focus of Hermes is always performance. So we're working on some significant improvements to our garbage collector. So GC is something that you can tune. You can tune the space of young generation. You can tune when to perform a major GC depending on the occupants and fragmentation ratio. So in a more advanced GC, you can tune how long do you want to pause, or it also known as stop the world. So we want to keep the pause time reasonably short. This would directly benefit the React Native's new architecture because now we have synchronous call into JavaScript. We're also working on reducing even more memory footprint. So one of them is called Hermes Value32. Currently, all JavaScript value are represented as tagged value, which is 64 bits, so it can represent pointer on 64 bits architecture. But we're working on a 32 bits version of that with pointer compression. Another one is small array optimization. We kind of observe that most of the arrays in React app are usually more like a tuple because of the React hooks. You always get a tuple destructured from the set state, uh, use state, use reducer, that kind of hooks, right? So we can specialize those kind of small array to use inline storage without actual storage allocation. So the third point is tooling. We're constantly improving the vertical integration with React Native tooling ecosystem, uh, such as debugger, profiling, source map, that kind of thing. Um, there's currently an unstable transform profile for Hermes in the Metro bundler, where you can drop half of the Babel transform to speed up the bundling. So working on removing more Babel transform and stabilize that profile. There are also many other explorational items that need to be proved to be good. But in general, I think we are tuned for the practice from React Native community. This gave us some focus and some freedom that other general purpose JavaScript engine can do. Last but not least, we will always have feature requests from the open source community, of course.
From Microsoft's perspective, in our partnership with Facebook, one big hurdle to making the switch, right, for React Native to use Hermes by default was being able to support native APIs that are really important. And the one that we partnered on is the native internationalization APIs, so the Intel spec, because as I understand it, but I might be wrong or it's outdated, Facebook itself doesn't use the native API, yet it is considered a requirement for the community before we can make that switch, which seems like the responsible choice to make. We obviously should not make it harder for people to do the right thing when it comes to internationalization. What I know from that is that Microsoft has contributed to Hermes the Android part of that. That's completed. For React Native Windows, while React Native Windows and macOS currently are not a requirement to decide what gets enabled by default, in upstream React Native, there is the aspiration to be in sync, and so React Native Windows currently does have an implementation of the Intel APIs, but it relies on something called ICU, which it's just like, let's just say it's like a globally used API to power internationalization. So it comes from the Unicode Consortium, if I recall correctly, but not all platforms provide it, and it has a lot of metadata. So that's something that you want to ship with the application. And so I don't think all Windows platforms provide ICU, or at least not in a way that any application can use it. And so the current effort was to port that work to use the sanctioned, what is it called, Windows globalization APIs. And actually the same thing was on my plate to do for macOS before I transitioned to Teams. So I can't say what the state of it is right now, but the issue is pretty much the same. macOS and iOS both rely on ICU to do that work, but only one of them provides a little bit of the API to applications. Otherwise, it's considered private, and so it's also unfortunate that we can't do a straight port of the existing Android work, which uses ICU directly, to these other platforms. They have to be, transpiled, I guess, in a sense, to not use ICU, but use the sanctioned APIs, which on Windows is the globalization APIs, and on macOS and iOS is the, just the core foundation APIs that allow for some internationalization. So it is interesting, how Facebook doesn't even actually use those APIs, but it is considered essential to the community, right? So we always have to balance what is the right thing to do for the community, like what is our vision of what type of applications React Native delivers, and this is just a responsible thing to do.
Yeah, that actually makes me wonder, what is it that Facebook is doing internally if they are not using the Intel APIs? Probably something custom, right?
I hear they have a few more engineers than the average application developer. So,
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's right. But it's great to hear that, there is an effort to make that work for the community. I guess that's really great that, you're still keeping that perspective in mind. Is there any place where one can track the progress on this, like a GitHub issue, umbrella issue, or a project, or something like that? We can link later in the podcast.
That's a great question. Let me find something. I think all the work that we in our partnership agree on taking on should be public. So I'll find the link and we can link it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we can include it later in the description notes. So if you are listening to this part, you can check the description. That's where it should be.
So definitely upload for Microsoft, the Intel work from Microsoft. So Hermes has been really great for us at Facebook. So as Eloy mentioned, there have been a few blockers that keep the community from being able to adopt it, notably Proxy and Intel. Each had over like 100 thumb ups on the feature requesting issue. So for the Proxy, we recently make a default and release with the React Native 0.64. And that actually a feature Facebook doesn't use internally as well. So it's built entirely for the open source community. And for the Intel works, thanks for Microsoft, the Android Intel support is very close to completion. The plan is to release Intel with React Native 0.65 for Android. So stay tuned for that. As for what Facebook use internally for internationalization, we use FBT, which is also recently open source. So the Intel API is also for the community.
I kind of would like to do another podcast on FBT because I just Googled it in the meantime when you said it, and it's quite interesting. Approach. Like it's always an interesting like concept when I see Facebook having their own implementations of things that we would say are obvious and are sort of publicly assumed to be the go-to choices, and still the Facebook scale sometimes leverages basic problems and shortcomings that at your scale just don't work. And so that's why it's always great to have sort of deep dive into reasonings behind these. So definitely going to write down for the next podcast. But I guess we can wrap up the first part and quickly move to the second part.